In today's story, we follow Claire, a retired nurse who leads a tranquil and solitary life after years of a difficult relationship. When she receives an unexpected letter informing her that her former love is gravely ill and wishes to see her before passing away, Claire faces an emotional dilemma: revisit a painful past or let time take its course. And you, in this situation, what would you do? Claire closed the window of her house as the last gust of cold wind blew through the furniture before she turned the latch. It was already night, and her routine remained strictly the same. Every object in its proper place, with the sound of the clock echoing through the small living room. She settled into the armchair next to the fireplace, arranging a blanket over her legs as she held the book she had started days before. As she ran her fingers through the pages, they found an old photo among them, a blurry image of two young people laughing together on a beach. Mark embraced Claire, his wide smile and eyes gleaming with enthusiasm. She sighed and shifted uncomfortably. Time had played its part, and that memory, which should have been sweet, only brought the bitter taste of abandonment. She got up and went to the kitchen to prepare tea. While the kettle boiled, her eyes fixed on the reflection in the mirror. The 55-year-old woman staring back at her was no longer the young, smiling woman in the photo. "Enough," she murmured, stepping away to avoid confronting herself. Claire had decided to live alone, with no room for new relationships. Her last romance with Mark had left her broken. At first, he was charismatic and charming, but over time, his subtle control over her turned into open manipulation. He isolated her from friends and made critical comments about her choices, undermining her confidence until Claire believed she wasn't good enough. Mark left without warning, leaving her alone and shattered. She rebuilt her life by dedicating herself to nursing, but she never got involved again, fearing to relive that pain. Despite this, she maintained her kindness. She had been a dedicated nurse, known for her empathy and strength in the face of the most challenging situations. Even in retirement, she remained attentive to the needs of her neighbors, helping with simple tasks and offering medical advice. In the small town where she lived, she was respected and loved, but she always returned to a silent house, the echoes of laughter and conversations dissipating into emptiness. She missed the vibrant life she had once shared, but she preferred solitude to the uncertainty of an abusive relationship. At night, while organizing papers on the table, she found another old photo, this time just of her. The younger, smiling face seemed distant, and Claire sighed deeply. She wondered if one day she could find peace with herself, if she could finally bury the past. It was an answer that always seemed out of reach. The next morning, Claire woke up with the first rays of sun warming her silent room. She had her breakfast, checked her daily tasks list, and went out to do some shopping in the small town. Moving through the aisles of the market, she waved to her neighbors, exchanging quick and kind words. Upon returning home, she saw an envelope on the door with the name and address carefully handwritten. Intrigued, she picked it up and went inside, sitting at the kitchen table to read its contents. It was a letter from a hospital in a distant state. The sender, a nurse named Sarah, explained that Mark was terminally ill and wanted to see her before he died. Claire reread the words, her mind spinning with a mix of emotions. The name Mark made her recoil as if she had been struck. A wave of painful memories resurfaced, reopening wounds she thought were healed. Leaning her head in her hands, she felt a knot tighten in her throat. "Why now?" she whispered softly to herself. "Why after all this time?" She sat in silence, pondering what the letter meant. She knew that by deciding to see him, she would be jeopardizing the stability she had spent years building. Still, the possibility of answers attracted her, giving hope for a resolution to the painful story that connected them. Uncertainty kept her still for several hours until the phone rang. An elderly neighbor needed help with her medication, and Claire promptly went to visit her. The familiar interaction temporarily calmed her, allowing her to push aside thoughts of the letter. When she returned home at dusk, however, the letter was still on the table, patiently waiting. She sighed, sitting down to read Sarah's simple and straightforward words again. Mark was alone and needed her. She knew there would be no easy path, but the need to understand why he left without explanations, the desire to close this chapter, spoke louder. After a sleepless night, the decision finally came. Claire took the suitcase from the closet and began packing her clothes, determined to confront the past. The hospital was several hours away, and Claire arrived exhausted. The tension from the letter and the anxiety about the meeting left her shoulders heavy as she climbed the steps to the reception. Nurse Sarah, a young woman with a serene face, recognized her immediately and led her to Mark's room. "He's awake. He asked for you several times," Sarah informed her in a low voice. Claire nodded, thanking her as she adjusted her coat. The partially open door revealed a dimly lit room, and she took a deep breath before entering. Mark was lying down, his eyes closed and his chest rising and falling slowly. Upon hearing the door creak, he opened his eyes, recognizing her instantly. A shadow of a smile appeared on his lips. "Claire!" She stood still near the door, watching him for a moment. The man in front of her was no longer the same as in her dreams. He was visibly frail, with sunken eyes and thinning hair. Finally, she approached, stopping by the bedside. "You asked to see me," she said, keeping her voice steady. Mark took a deep breath, a faint groan escaping his lips. "I'm sorry," he murmured, "for leaving you like that. I was scared and didn't know how to deal with it." Claire stared at him, her arms crossed. "Scared? You abandoned me, Mark, without a word. Years have passed. You don't know what you did to me." He closed his eyes, his hands trembling as they found Claire's. "I know I can't fix this, but I didn't want to die without apologizing, without telling you that I regret it." Claire fell silent, her fingers tightly interlaced with his. She felt anger, frustration, and hurt, but also something else. Despite everything, Mark's vulnerability stirred something within her. He was asking for forgiveness, which made her wonder if she could leave the past behind. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she finally said. "I understand," he replied with difficulty, "but I'm glad you came." The room fell silent as Claire processed those words. She knew it wouldn't be easy to care for Mark in the coming days, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. She decided to stay by his side, not to forgive him immediately, but to understand his quest for redemption. Claire's presence in the hospital became constant. She helped him drink water, adjusted his pillows, and coordinated care with Sarah. Mark watched her closely, thanking her whenever he could. She didn't smile, but she became a presence he could feel, a comforting presence in his final days. And there, amidst apologies and conversations interrupted by exhaustion, the two began to find some common ground, building a space where their wounds could heal. The following days passed slowly, each one marked by a repetitive routine of care and conversations. Claire took on the role of Mark's caregiver, a position that was familiar to her, but this time, emotionally exhausting. At first, she only did what was necessary, making sure he took his medication, helping him get up, and tidying the room. Mark, in turn, thanked her with tired eyes, murmuring apologies whenever he saw her hesitate to hand him a glass of water or adjust his pillow. "I don't need pity, Claire," he would say weakly. "I just want your understanding." However, as she watched him decline each day, his trembling hands trying to hold the mug and his breath becoming slower, Claire felt her heart slowly open. One day, while adjusting the blanket around him, she asked, "Why did you run away? Why couldn't you be honest with me?" Mark fell silent for a moment. His voice came out strained, interrupted by pain and weakness. "I was afraid of being rejected, afraid I wasn't ready for commitment. I thought that if I left you, It would be easier, but instead, I ruined what we had." She nodded, trying to process the explanation. "And do you think apologizing can undo all of that?" He looked away. "No, but it's all I can offer now." Upon hearing this, Claire finally understood what time and illness had done to Mark. He was just a shadow of the man she had known, stripped of his arrogance and the emotional games that had driven them apart. It was clear that he truly regretted his actions. She continued to care for him, but now she did so with a little more kindness. She spent hours by his side, holding his hand and listening to his stories. Mark talked about the opportunities he wasted, the women he hurt, and the chances he never had the courage to seize. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Claire," he admitted one day, "and it's too late to fix it, but I will always remember you." Claire listened in silence, fighting back tears. There was much still to be said, but she knew that only time would reveal if she would be able to forgive him completely. Either way, in that moment, the connection they shared offered some consolation for both of them. In those final days, she was the rock upon which Mark leaned, trying to make his last hours as comfortable as possible. Her anger began to dissipate, giving way to compassion and a growing desire to help Mark find peace. She knew he was paying the price for his choices, and her job was to ensure that he didn't depart alone. On Mark's last night, Claire sat beside him, holding his cold hand firmly. His breathing was weak and irregular, but his expression was serene. He looked at her with heavy eyes, giving a fragile smile. "I'm glad you came," he whispered. "I know," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I am too." They sat in silence for a moment. Claire felt a lump form in her throat, but she couldn't let the emotion show. She ran her hand through Mark's hair, as she had been doing in the past few days. "Do you need anything?" she asked, breaking the silence. "No," he replied with a small sigh. "I just want to hear you talk." And so she began to tell simple stories of the childhood spent on farms and the adventures with friends in youth. Mark listened attentively, occasionally smiling, as Claire's words filled the darkness of the room. With each story, she felt the tension easing and allowed herself a brief sense of peace. Later, Mark closed his eyes and never opened them again. He passed away peacefully, his fingers still intertwined with Claire's. She felt a wave of sadness and relief wash over her, but she knew she needed to leave. The next morning, she signed the hospital documents and left Mark's room with tense shoulders. As she stepped out of the hospital, the cold breeze met her face, but she didn't flinch. Back in the car, she rested her head on the steering wheel and took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the horizon. As she drove back home, she thought about what it meant to lose Mark for the second time. There was no easy solution to the pain, but she knew she had managed to find something resembling closure. Mark had asked for forgiveness, and although it hadn't been an easy process, she had helped him find some peace. In the days that followed, she found herself rearranging the house, opening the windows, and tidying up the furniture. Her neglected garden was revived, and she planted flowers she had always wanted, a small promise to herself to allow life to bloom again, this time without the ghosts of the past. While the healing process wasn't simple, she decided she would do her best to start anew. She still felt the sadness of loss, but also a lightness in knowing she was free to embrace new possibilities. The morning sun illuminated the house as Claire watered her flowers, ready to open her heart to the world once again. If you enjoyed this touching and emotional story, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment letting us know what you would do in Claire's place. Your opinion is very important to us, and if you're not already subscribed, join us on the channel for more inspiring and engaging stories. See you in the next video.